You cut the canola oil, the vegetable oil, the sunflower oil out of your kitchen this week. Butter, olive oil, maybe tallow now. And by day 4 or 5, you genuinely feel different. Less bloated. A little more even energy through the afternoon instead of that 3 p.m. crash. You've seen the videos and the posts claiming this is your mitochondria waking back up, healing themselves from years of oxidative damage, practically overnight. And that feeling is real, you're not imagining it. But before I tell you what's actually happening inside your cells this week, I need to be straight with you about something almost nobody making those videos is willing to say clearly, because the honest version of this story is more useful to you than the dramatic one, even though it's less exciting. I went and looked at what the actual human research says about seed oils and mitochondrial damage before making this video, and here's the short version. The mechanism you've probably heard about, that linoleic acid gets absorbed into your mitochondrial membranes and makes them dangerously prone to oxidative damage, is a real, legitimate area of biochemistry research. It is not, at this point, something that's been demonstrated to actually harm healthy humans eating ordinary amounts of these oils in controlled human studies. And some of the most viral claims currently circulating, specific named studies with dramatic statistics attached to them, don't hold up when you actually try to find the paper. So let's walk through, carefully and honestly, what's genuinely known, what's still just a hypothesis, and what's actually happening in your body during that week you're feeling different, because the real explanation turns out to be interesting on its own, without needing to exaggerate it. What's actually established, and what isn't? Here's the biochemistry that is genuinely well documented and not in dispute. Linoleic acid, the dominant fatty acid in oils like soybean, corn, sunflower, and canola oil, is a polyunsaturated fat, meaning its molecular structure contains multiple double bonds. Those double bonds make it chemically more reactive and more prone to oxidation than saturated or monounsaturated fats, which is basic, uncontested organic chemistry. When polyunsaturated fats do oxidize, whether inside the body or in a bottle sitting on a shelf too long, they can form reactive breakdown compounds, including one called 4-hydroxynonenal, that are genuinely capable of causing cellular damage in laboratory settings. All of that part is real chemistry, confirmed repeatedly in cell culture and animal studies. Where the story gets stretched is the leap from that laboratory chemistry to the specific claim you've probably seen packaged as breaking news, that eating ordinary amounts of seed oil in a normal diet measurably damages human mitochondria within days, driving disease. When you actually go looking for the human evidence behind that claim, it isn't there in the way the claim implies. Large, long-running human cohort studies and randomized controlled trials looking at linoleic acid intake and health outcomes consistently find the opposite of what the mitochondrial damage narrative would predict. Replacing saturated fat with linoleic acid-rich oils in controlled human trials has repeatedly been associated with lower cardiovascular event rates, and major cardiology and nutrition organizations have continued recommending that substitution based on that body of evidence. That doesn't automatically mean seed oils are perfectly harmless in every context, but it does mean the dramatic damage narrative and the actual outcome data currently point in different directions, which is worth sitting with honestly rather than picking whichever one is more shareable. There's something else worth naming directly, because it matters for how you evaluate anything you encounter on this topic going forward. Some of the specific studies currently being cited in viral seed oil content, complete with named researchers, named universities, and specific participant counts, don't actually correspond to any real published paper when you try to track them down. That's not a minor detail. It means a meaningful share of what's driving this narrative online right now isn't exaggerated science, it's fabricated science, invented entirely to make a real, more modest, more boring hypothesis sound like a settled, dramatic discovery. I'm telling you this not to dismiss the underlying question, which is genuinely worth asking, but because you deserve to know the difference between a legitimate open question in nutritional biochemistry and a made-up citation dressed up to look like one. It's also worth understanding why this particular narrative has taken off so effectively, because the mechanism being described genuinely does sound compelling on the surface, and that's part of the problem. Cardiolipin, the phospholipid at the center of this claim, really is essential to how mitochondria produce energy, and it really is true that its fatty acid composition partially reflects dietary fat intake, and it really is true that polyunsaturated fats oxidize more readily than saturated ones in a test tube. Every individual fact in the chain is accurate. What gets stretched is the final leap, from this is chemically plausible and shows effects in isolated cells or animal models fed extreme, unrealistic doses to this is definitely happening to you right now, in exactly this way, from the amount of oil in your actual diet. That's the leap human clinical research hasn't confirmed, and it's the leap that turns a genuinely interesting, still developing hypothesis into a viral, oversimplified, and in some cases outright fabricated claim. It's not that your mitochondria healed in a week. It's what actually changed on your plate. Here's the honest reframe, and it's actually more useful to you than the dramatic version, because it points you toward what's genuinely worth changing instead of what makes for a better thumbnail. Mitochondrial membranes, including the fatty acid composition of cardiolipin, the specific phospholipid at the center of the seed oil debate, do incorporate whatever fats you've been eating, but that incorporation happens through the ordinary, gradual process of cell membrane turnover, which research on membrane lipid composition puts on a timescale of weeks to months, not days. If a genuine shift in your mitochondrial membrane composition were the reason you felt different by day 5, the biology simply doesn't move that fast. Something else, something real and worth understanding, is behind that week 1 feeling, and it has less to do with a single villain nutrient and more to do with several ordinary changes that happen automatically the moment someone decides to cut seed oils. Let's walk through what actually happens when most people make this switch, because the real explanation is genuinely interesting once you see it laid out honestly. Cell membranes, including the inner mitochondrial membrane where cardiolipin sits, are not static structures. They're continuously rebuilt through an ongoing process of lipid turnover, old phospholipid molecules broken down and replaced with new ones assembled from whatever fatty acids happen to be circulating in your bloodstream at the time. That process is real, and it does mean that over a sustained period of dietary change, membrane fatty acid composition genuinely can shift to reflect what you've been eating. But research tracking the actual speed of that turnover, using techniques that measure how quickly labeled fatty acids get incorporated into membrane phospholipids, consistently finds this is a slow, gradual process, meaningfully measured in weeks, and for some tissue types closer to a couple of months, before a dietary change produces a clearly measurable shift in membrane composition. A single week of different cooking oil is nowhere near enough time for that underlying structural change to have meaningfully occurred, regardless of how the improvement is being marketed. The first thing that changes, almost always, is exposure to genuinely oxidized, rancid fat, and this is the piece of the story that's actually well supported by real research, separate from the fresh oil in your kitchen question. Oils used repeatedly for deep frying, particularly in restaurant fryers reused across many cooking cycles at high heat, do accumulate meaningfully high levels of those reactive oxidation compounds researchers have studied, including the 4-hydroxynonenal mentioned earlier. That's not a fringe claim, it's documented food science, and it applies specifically to heavily reused, high-heat frying oil, not to a normal amount of fresh oil used once in a home kitchen. When someone cuts seed oils, they're very often simultaneously cutting fried fast food, gas station snacks, and heavily processed packaged foods cooked in oil that's been through exactly that kind of repeated high-heat reuse. That's a real, meaningful reduction in genuinely oxidized fat intake. It just isn't caused by the chemical identity of the oil itself so much as by how many times and how hot it was heated before it reached your plate. The second thing that changes is the food category shift hiding underneath the oil swap. For most people, cutting seed oils in practice means cutting an entire category of ultra-processed food, because seed oils are the default fat in the overwhelming majority of packaged snacks, fried foods, and fast food menu items. Someone who switches to cooking primarily with butter, olive oil, or tallow at home is, almost automatically, cooking more meals from actual whole ingredients rather than reaching for something pre-made. That shift alone, independent of the specific fat involved, is well documented to reduce sodium intake, reduce added sugar intake, reduce genuinely inflammatory ultra-processed additives, and increase overall diet quality. A noticeable chunk of the My Energy is more stable now feeling reported after cutting seed oils is very plausibly this broader dietary quality improvement doing the work, credited entirely to the oil itself simply because the oil was the thing someone consciously decided to change first. The third thing worth understanding honestly is the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio question, which is a real, actively studied area, though it's more nuanced than either side of the online debate usually presents it. Modern diets in most industrialized countries do skew heavily toward omega-6 fats relative to omega-3 fats, largely because seed oils are so ubiquitous in processed food while omega-3 rich foods like fatty fish, walnuts, and flax remain comparatively rare in the average diet. There is genuine research suggesting that ratio matters for the balance of certain signaling molecules involved in inflammation, and that an extremely skewed ratio may plausibly contribute to a more pro-inflammatory baseline state in some people, though the human evidence on this specific point is considerably less conclusive than the mitochondrial damage claims imply, and it's a different, more modest claim than seed oil destroys your cells. For someone who cuts seed oil consumption and simultaneously, even unintentionally, starts eating a bit more fish or a handful of walnuts instead of a bag of chips, that ratio genuinely does shift in a direction some research associates with lower inflammatory markers. It's worth noting this is a ratio question rather than a pure elimination question, which is a distinction that tends to get lost in the online version of this discussion. A diet that's simply lower in overall processed food, with a more balanced mix of fat sources, moves that ratio in a favorable direction regardless of whether a specific bottle of vegetable oil ever gets thrown out of the pantry at all. Why the first week framing is doing more marketing than biology. I want to be direct about something specific to this claim, because it's the part almost every viral version of this topic gets wrong on purpose. The idea that your mitochondria specifically reactivate within 7 days misunderstands, or deliberately misrepresents, how mitochondrial biology actually works. Mitochondria are not sitting dormant, waiting to be switched back on the moment a specific oil leaves your kitchen. They are constantly active, constantly producing ATP, in every single cell in your body, every day, seed oil or not. What can genuinely change over a week is your subjective energy, digestion, and inflammation markers, driven by the real factors just described: reduced intake of genuinely oxidized frying fat, reduced ultra-processed food overall, and a modestly improved fat ratio. What cannot genuinely happen over a week is a measurable remodeling of your mitochondrial membrane's actual fatty acid composition, because that process, confirmed in research tracking how quickly membrane phospholipids turn over and incorporate new dietary fats, simply runs on a much slower clock, closer to a month or more of consistent dietary change before a meaningful shift in membrane composition would show up. None of this means the underlying hypothesis about linoleic acid and cardiolipin oxidation is worthless or that researchers studying it are wrong to keep investigating it. It's a legitimate, ongoing area of biochemistry research, and it's entirely possible future human trials will find something the current evidence hasn't yet demonstrated. But there's a meaningful difference between researchers are investigating whether this matters and this has been proven, and here is a dramatic statistic to make you feel the urgency, and right now, an uncomfortable amount of what's circulating online has quietly slid from the first framing into the second one without the evidence actually catching up. What genuinely matters here. I don't want this video to leave you with nothing actionable, because there are real, evidence-supported changes buried underneath all of this worth taking seriously. They're just more specific and less dramatic than seed oils are poisoning your cells. The single most well-supported change is avoiding heavily reused, high-heat frying oil, specifically, the kind used repeatedly in commercial deep fryers rather than fresh oil used once in a home kitchen. If you're cutting back on fried fast food and heavily fried restaurant food generally, you're addressing the piece of this puzzle that actually has solid research behind it, regardless of which specific oil was originally in the fryer. At home, this simply means not reusing frying oil more than once or twice, storing oil away from heat and light to slow oxidation, and watching for the genuine warning signs of rancidity, a sharp or bitter smell, darkened color, or a noticeably different taste, rather than assuming any oil sitting in the pantry for months is automatically fine simply because the bottle isn't empty yet. Second, prioritizing whole, minimally processed foods over packaged and ultra-processed alternatives captures most of the diet quality benefit people report after cutting seed oils, independent of the oil question entirely. If cutting seed oils is the lever that gets you cooking more meals at home from real ingredients, that behavior change is doing meaningful, well-documented work on its own, and it's worth recognizing that the benefit is coming from that broader shift rather than crediting it entirely to the specific fat that happened to be swapped out along the way. Third, if you're concerned about the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio specifically, the more evidence-aligned move is adding omega-3 sources, fatty fish a couple of times a week, walnuts, ground flaxseed, rather than eliminating omega-6 entirely, since omega-6 fats including linoleic acid are essential nutrients your body cannot make on its own and genuinely needs in some amount for normal cell membrane structure and function. Total elimination isn't the target the research actually points toward. A better ratio, achieved by adding the underrepresented side rather than stripping out the essential nutrient entirely, is the more defensible goal. Fourth, matching the oil to the cooking method matters more than which specific oil is villainized online. Oils with a lower smoke point, including extra virgin olive oil, are better suited to lower heat cooking and finishing than to repeated high heat frying, where they're more prone to breaking down into exactly the oxidized compounds this whole conversation is actually concerned about. A refined oil with a higher smoke point used appropriately for high-heat cooking, used fresh rather than reused repeatedly, is a genuinely different exposure than the same oil reheated across a dozen fry cycles in a commercial kitchen. Thinking in terms of appropriate use for a given oil, rather than a permanent list of good oils and bad oils, tracks the actual chemistry far more accurately than a blanket rule ever could. The myth worth killing here: you've probably seen the confident claim, sometimes attached to a specific named study, that seed oils have now been definitively proven to destroy mitochondrial function and that avoiding them for even a short period reverses years of cellular damage. I want to be plain about this, because it's the actual myth this video set out to address. That specific framing outruns what the current human evidence actually supports, and in at least some cases circulating right now, it's built on citations to studies that don't appear to exist as described. The real, more modest, more honest version of this story, that heavily reused fried food is worth limiting, that ultra-processed food generally deserves scrutiny, and that omega-6 to omega-3 balance is worth paying attention to, is genuinely useful and worth acting on. It just isn't the same claim as your mitochondria were being poisoned and you fixed it in a week, and conflating the two does you a disservice, because it points you toward the wrong lever, eliminating a single ingredient entirely, when the actual research supports a more targeted and considerably less dramatic set of changes. Being honest about the limits here, I don't want to overcorrect in the other direction either, because that would be its own kind of dishonesty. This is a genuinely active area of research, and it's entirely reasonable to make food choices based on caution even where the human evidence isn't fully settled yet, particularly around minimizing heavily reused fried oil, which does have real support behind it. If you have a specific inflammatory or metabolic condition, some research does suggest individual variation in how people respond to different fat profiles, and that's a conversation worth having with a doctor or dietitian who knows your specific situation, rather than either the dramatic seed oil warnings or a blanket dismissal settling it for you. What this video is pushing back on specifically isn't caution about food quality, which is reasonable. It's the packaging of a still-open biochemistry question as a proven, urgent, days-to-reverse crisis, complete with invented studies, because that packaging tends to point people toward eliminating a single ingredient rather than toward the broader, better-supported dietary patterns that actually seem to matter most. It's also worth saying plainly that skepticism toward one exaggerated narrative shouldn't collapse into skepticism toward nutrition science generally. The reason this video can point to large human cohort studies and controlled trials on linoleic acid and cardiovascular outcomes at all is because that kind of research exists, gets peer-reviewed, and gets revised over time as new data comes in, which is exactly the process that hasn't yet caught up with the mitochondrial damage claims in humans. That's a meaningfully different situation than a claim with no real research process behind it at all. Holding both of those things at once, taking the established cardiovascular research seriously while remaining genuinely open to what future, better-designed human trials on the mitochondrial question might eventually find, is a more honest position than fully embracing either extreme currently competing for your attention online. Coming back to that week 1 feeling, think back to feeling genuinely better by day 4 or 5 after cutting the seed oil out of your kitchen. That feeling wasn't imaginary, and it wasn't nothing. It just wasn't your mitochondria being rescued from years of damage in the span of a single week, because that specific claim doesn't match how the actual biology works. It was very plausibly a combination of real, well-supported changes happening at the same time, meaningfully less genuinely oxidized frying fat reaching your plate, meaningfully less ultra-processed food overall, and possibly a somewhat better balance of the fats you were eating, all bundled together under the label of a single ingredient that made for a cleaner story than the truth actually is. Picture what's actually useful on the other side of this. It isn't treating one nutrient as the sole villain behind everything that's ever felt off in your body. It's understanding specifically which piece of that change is doing the real work, so you can keep doing the parts that matter, watching heavily reused fried food, favoring whole ingredients, paying attention to your fat ratios, without needing an exaggerated, occasionally fabricated narrative to justify a choice that was already reasonable on its own, honest terms. The feeling you noticed this week was real. The explanation being sold alongside it, for the most part, wasn't. Now you know which parts of this story are actually worth keeping, and which parts were just built to make a much more ordinary truth sound like a breaking discovery.